I've talked about a number of shockingly alarming stories on this channel over the years, including a number of different departments, even government departments, doctors, professionals, members of parliament, ministers, and today's no exception. But today it involves women and children to a profound degree that this absolutely must command a level of investigation, it must command attention, and we absolutely must take this seriously because children could be harmed and women could be harmed, and we absolutely must share this far and wide. So please do share the video so it reaches a wider audience, because I do humbly suspect that my videos have some impact on some individuals. At least I hope so. And that is with your help. It's all down to you guys watching and sharing these videos. So what I'm talking about today is a doctor who appears to promote the idea of providing drugs, medicines to children to block puberty because they feel like they're in the wrong body. Now, I have every respect for someone with gender dysphoria, but this absolutely needs attention because just to be clear, there's currently a ban in the UK on puberty blockers, prescribing puberty blockers to anyone under the age of 18 years old. With that in mind, I want to take you to a short snippet. You can find the full version over on YouTube. It'll be linked here if you look up Colin Wright here, and he's linked this YouTube video here. This debate, this gender debate with Helen Webberley. Now, just for some context and background, Helen Webberley was prosecuted by the Healthcare Inspectorate of Wales for running an unauthorised healthcare service. It said it's to date successfully prosecuted Online GP Services Limited and Dr. Helen Webberley for illegally providing online healthcare services which require registration under the Care Standards Act 2000. It doesn't say here, but I understand that she was required to pay £12,000 fine and costs. It says the prosecution follows a period in which she'd refused to stop providing services to patients. As a result, they proceeded with criminal action against the company and her for operating the service without being registered under Section 11 of the Healthcare Act. Both Online GP Services Limited and she were found guilty at the Magistrates Court, and that was before the sentencing took place. Now, back to this. Now, the reason that this is so important is because they appear, or she appears to be advocating or describing what can only really be described as a loophole around the ban on these drugs to children in the UK. Have a listen to this.
Right, you obviously don't support that ban. Do you prescribe cross-sex hormones instead to young people?
The options for young people who can't have puberty blockers, the ones that are banned, which are the GnRH
Yes.
analogues, is that they can take other medicines to suppress their natural hormone production or the effects of their natural hormone.
So are you prescribing cross-sex hormones?
I don't prescribe any, but that's up because I don't practice as a doctor at the moment. I don't prescribe, but doctors in this country will use other medicines to suppress puberty or the effects of puberty.
Right.
So quite clearly and openly, plainly describing that doctors in this country are getting around this ban with some sort of loophole by prescribing other drugs which suppress hormones, which ultimately have the same effect. Now, I'm not a doctor, I don't profess to be, but as a lawyer, I can tell you that if somebody does something for the sole purpose to circumvent a ban on something, that is usually going to be a tantamount to committing whatever the underlying prohibition is. So if they prescribe B to achieve the result, when drug A is designed to achieve that result, then they are circumventing the ban. So this absolutely, categorically, 100% must be investigated. If this is what's happening, it must be investigated. So that I will leave with to whomever watches this video and knows somebody that can look into it, share it with somebody that needs to investigate this. That absolutely must happen. Now, that is not the only purpose for this video. Now, there is also another aspect of this, which I'll turn to Nadia Whittome MP, who is she's on the committee for the Women and Equalities Committee. Now, this should uphold everything under the Equality Act, which, as you know from the Supreme Court ruling, sex in the Equality Act is based on biology. Just to be absolutely clear, if I jiggery-pokery this screen share, you can see this a little bit better. This unequivocally says about the Equality Act that the wording and the language in the Equality Act means sex, woman and man refer to biological sex, biological woman and biological man. It says, in other words, in relation to sex discrimination, a person with a protected characteristic of sex has the characteristic of their biological sex only. A trans man with a GRC, a biological female, but legally male for the purposes under Section 9 of the GRA 2004, is a woman for the purposes of the Equality Act. And a trans woman with a GRC, biologically male, legally female, for the purposes of Section 9, is a man and not entitled to be treated as a woman under the Equality Act. But it also goes on to say this does not remove or diminish the important protections available under the Equality Act for trans people with a GRC as explained. So in other words, the protection remains in place for trans people. So if an employer were to say, I'm not employing you because I don't like trans people, that is discriminatory. And so that would be wrong, both morally and legally, because just because we advocate for one thing doesn't mean that we're against the people. This is a common, I'll come back to Nadia Whittam's thing in a minute and the point that I'm trying to make, but this is a common misconception that if you are pro-women rights, that you're anti-trans. And this is utterly infuriating because they label it up as anti-trans and transphobic. And they try to say, people that make this argument, try to say that if we or any of us are pro-women and fighting for women's rights to keep women's spaces separate and so on, they try to say that we are transphobic, anti-trans and everything else. That is absolutely not true, at least for the vast majority of people. Now, some people may be anti-trans and may be directly attacking them for the purposes of attacking them, and that is clearly wrong. You shouldn't attack anybody. I personally know some people who identify themselves as trans or non-binary or whatever, and I have complete respect for them. They have respect for me because they know that I have respect for them. I think some possibly would take the wrong view and think that, I am anti-trans or whatever, which is absolutely not true. But we need to get away from this idea that being pro-women's rights and protecting women's rights, or men's rights for that matter, in accordance with the law, as clarified by the Supreme Court ruling, that is that sex is biological and a woman is a biological woman and a man is a biological man, and we should protect those spaces accordingly. If we fight for those rights, doesn't mean that we are anti-trans, and we need to get away from this idea. With all that said, the following will now make sense that I'm going to talk about in Nadia Whittam MP's post here. This is talking about the leaked guidance, which I think I lose track now. I think it was on my video yesterday, either on this channel or Black Belt Secrets this morning. But I think it was on my video yesterday. But this talks about the leaked guidance about the from the EHRC, the guidance for applying the Supreme Court ruling, which, again, to be clear, to labour the point, just clarified what the law always was. It didn't change a thing. It just said, well, this is what it meant. It always meant that. Nothing's changed, but this is how it should be applied. So in my view, there doesn't need to be guidance. But nonetheless, she's talking about the guidance here. And so she's quoting this section here about that guidance, which says, trans people could be asked about whether they should be accessing single-sex services based on their physical appearance or behaviour, according to proposed new guidance seen by the BBC. So she's obviously quoting the BBC here. A code of practice produced by the Equalities Watchdog, the EHRC, and awaiting ministerial approval because, as I understand it, Bridget Phillipson is refusing to publish it, presumably because she doesn't like it, says it may be legitimate for businesses or services to ask people to provide confirmation that they are eligible sex by proportionate means. In other words, are you really a real woman, to enter this space? It acknowledges that there is no type of official record or document in the UK which proves reliable evidence of sex based on biology, because people can self-identify on documents such as passports. Equalities Minister Bridget Phillipson said she'd take the time needed to get this right. Now, yes, take the time needed to get it right, but you don't need lengthy documents and months of evaluation to apply the Supreme Court ruling. It should be absolutely crystal clear. Biological women only in biological spaces. Now, the problem we've got here is, if someone is let's say a trans woman with a GRC, a gender recognition certificate, which under the Gender Recognition Act means that they are legally female, which with great respect as a lawyer, I think is a little bit meaningless. unless you're applying it in the sense that an employer would discriminate against them on the basis of being legally a woman and so on and so forth. But apart from all that, the problem that this throws up is someone who is a trans woman with a GRC is legally female, but if they produce that as evidence of being female, it is not the same as being female under the Equality Act. They are still, under the Equality Act, they are still a man. That is absolute fact of biology and fact of law. So coming back to Nadia Whittam's post, with all that in mind, she says the following. Bearing in mind, as I said, she is on the Committee for Women and Equalities, which is supposed to protect women and equalities overall. Now, she makes the following comment about this guidance. This is a dark and dangerous path, she says. The government has said it won't be rushed, and I sincerely hope this is an indication that ministers will reject any EHRC guidance that further harms trans people. Just to be clear, I don't accept that it harms trans people to exclude, let's say, a trans woman from women's spaces or a trans man from men's spaces. I don't accept that. I think that is proportionate with regard to women's rights and men's rights accordingly. She goes on. Parliament should instead make explicitly clear in legislation that single-sex spaces are to be trans-inclusive, which, for the avoidance of doubt, is entirely contradictory to the Equality Act as confirmed by the Supreme Court. So, in the Equality Act, just to reiterate, women are biological women, men are biological men, and a single-sex space should be exactly that. Women only based on biology or men only based on biology. Nadia Whittam here on the Women and Equalities Committee says that Parliament should make clear in legislation that single sex should actually include men, biological men. This is the danger that we have here. Bearing in mind the first part of the opening of this video where we have a doctor advocating for getting around this ban by using other drugs that have the same effect. Now, you don't need to be a doctor, I suggest, to know that that is somehow ethically wrong. And I just don't agree with that. Nonetheless, that's not the only thing. Now, we also have, just to round this off, because I find this quite absurd, frankly, but this whole free breakfast for children thing, these free breakfast clubs, 500,000 children and 2 million something meals that they've served, which, by the way, 75% of schools said is not financially viable because the government wants to give them 60 pence per child, and the school has said, well, it's going to take something like £3 or more a child for the staff, the space, heating the building, and the food provided, all that sort of stuff. So it's just not financially viable. They put out this social media post here, bearing in mind when they originally sold the idea to you, it was on the basis that people need to get to work earlier, so therefore, they need to get their children to school earlier, therefore they should provide these clubs. Now, even that in place, with someone working, you might argue that, well, surely just pay for it then, pay for the breakfast club. Many people, I'm sure, will confirm that they pay for before school and after school clubs because they need to get their children there. Some people I accept can't afford it, and therefore this is useful, and that I perfectly accept and do, of course I'm not against children having breakfast and so on and so forth. But the underlying argument here was that that's what they were supposed to be for. With that in mind, in this clip here, I'm not going to play it because of the music on it for copyright, but these people here were asked, what would you do? Now, just to be clear, I don't think these people were using the scheme. They were asked, what would you do if you had 30 minutes extra? This first lady says she'll get a 5-minute nap. She said it's not enough, but a little time to relax. This woman here said, well, if she had the extra half hour, she'd go to a coffee shop. So, in other words, if she were to use this free breakfast club for a child, she'd then go to a coffee shop. That's not what they're for. That's surely not what they're supposed to be paid for. And bearing in mind, all the while, they're not free, they're paid for by taxpayers, which I don't wholesale object to if it really is helping children. But I do object to it if taxpayers are paying for that for free for some people who are then going to spend that money in the coffee shop. Because the taxpayer is then, however you skin this, the taxpayer is then spending that money so that that person can go to a coffee shop. This lady says she'd do something for herself. This one said housework. This guy said he'd be doing cleaning and whatever, so clearly at home as well. This guy said he'd be tidying up the room and doing that sort of stuff. And then this lady again says, if you're rushing around, sometimes you forget that you've eaten. Now, with great respect, if you forget whether your child's eaten or not, you're not doing your job as a parent. You really need to take a look at what your organization skills are. And then much the same, spend the time cleaning and whatever. But this is put out. I think this is absolutely tone deaf as to what people really think about this, because taxpayers paying for these clubs, okay, fine, so long as they are absolutely necessary and needed and going to a good cause and so on. But if this is the marketing to you, they are marketing the idea that you might get a chance to go to a coffee shop instead whilst dumping your children at the school. And bearing in mind that the wording in this, which I'll come back to here, it says free breakfast clubs transforming mornings for 500,000 children. That's 95 precious hours back each year. So it's saying that you get 95 precious hours back by putting your child at the school. Now, to me, the precious hours are spent with the child, surely. That's just the wrong phrasing. I mean, precious in the sense if they use it to go to work or something like that, which is really all it really should be used for. But precious hours, I mean, that should be spent with the children, surely. But I think this is completely tone deaf. But it all taken together, this shows you the attitudes towards women and children. And I think a lot of this is questionable. But as I say, please do share the video because this first bit about doctors, if they really are circumventing the ban by prescribing some kind of drugs to children that block hormones in a way which is intended to be banned by the ban on these puberty blockers, that is dangerous and that needs looking at. So please do share it. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and thank you for watching.